Welcome, beautiful soul. The angels have guided you here today, and that is no accident. You are divinely protected, deeply loved, and the heavens have a message just for you. This is Angel's message for you, and what you are about to hear could change everything. Stay with us until the very end, because what comes in the final moments of this message is the part the angels say you must not miss. Something is already moving in your favor. Are you ready to hear it? My dear one, there is something truly remarkable happening right now, and it has everything to do with you. The angels have come close today to share what even the eyes cannot see. Something that has already begun to shift in the most sacred place in the heart of the one who loves you. Your person has written a farewell, but do not let that word worry you for even a single moment. This is not the kind of farewell that brings fear or tears two souls apart. This is the kind of farewell that heals, that liberates, that clears away everything that has been standing between you and the love that was always meant to reach you. And most importantly, this farewell was never written for you. It was written for all the things that have kept this person from fully loving you the way they were always meant to. This person reached a breaking point, a moment when silently accepting everything that pulled them away from their own heart became too much to carry. And when someone reaches that place of divine exhaustion, the only path forward is to rise up in courage. That is exactly what is happening now. Your soulmate has made the most important decision of their life, to break completely free from everything that has been binding them, everything that has been suppressing what they feel, everything that has been suffocating a love that never stopped existing. This decision was firm, clear, and made with full awareness of what would come next. There is no turning back, and the angels want you to know that this farewell is the clearest sign yet that nothing will hold back what this person feels for you. It was not easy. For someone who feels so deeply, there is always the fear of losing, of hurting, of disappointing. But this time, fear did not win. What spoke louder was the true desire of the heart, to finally follow its own truth. No more waiting for others to understand. No more allowing life to be steered by demands, obligations, or outside opinions. This person grew so tired of holding back out of fear of judgment, family pressure, or disapproval. What comes first now is what they feel, what they want to live, and what they are ready to make happen. Your person wrote with an open heart a letter that no one else will ever read, but that will change absolutely everything. It was a farewell to situations that no longer fit, to bonds that no longer held truth, to voices that always tried to silence the sacred connection between you. This letter was not made of paper. It was made of choice. And when someone chooses to step away from what hurts in order to draw closer to what makes sense, the entire universe honors that decision. That is why the angels came to you today, because the moment has arrived to prepare you for what is about to unfold in the coming days. This person understood once and for all that they can no longer keep ignoring their own heart. And that clarity awakened a strength inside them that had long been sleeping. It is as if something unlocked deep within them, as if a wall that had stood for years was finally torn down. That is why this farewell happened now, because the time came to leave stagnation behind, to no longer accept the idea that they must wait a lifetime for something that, in truth, is already ready to happen. And when that kind of liberation occurs, nothing can stop the path forward. The most transformative decisions are almost always born in the silence of someone who can no longer pretend that everything is fine. And it was in that intimate, quiet silence that your soulmate took the action that changes the entire course of your shared story. This person no longer wants to stand still, no longer wants to stay silent, no longer wants to hide. The decision began as an outpouring and ended as a declaration of pure courage. From now on, everything will be guided by what they feel for you, and only that. This action was not impulsive. It was built little by little, like a truth that grew steadily in the chest until it could no longer be contained. And now it overflows. This person said goodbye to old fears, to family demands, to relationships without soul, to obligations that no longer spoke to the heart. They said goodbye to everything that ever made them forget what truly matters. And do you know what remained standing after all of that was released? The feeling for you. You have no idea how much inner strength it took to take this step. But your soulmate took it with faith, with courage, and with love. And that is why the angels are here right now, because you need to be ready for what comes next. What happens next will surprise you, and it will arrive like a gift that comes at exactly the right time. This person finally understood that waiting and hoping things would sort themselves out was no longer something they were willing to do. For the first time, they truly saw that if there was no action taken now, everything would remain frozen in place. And the love they carry for you is far too great to keep postponing, shelving, or suffocating under rules and conventions that no longer serve any real purpose. No one on the outside can fully understand how many times this person held themselves back, out of fear of seeming wrong, out of fear of making a mistake. But there is no more room for that now. Decisions are no longer being made based on what others expect. They are being guided by what this person feels every single time they think of you. And even though some challenges still exist, the choice has been made to wait no longer, to stay silent no longer, to live as if what they feel were just a small detail in life no longer. For a long time, this person put off taking action with the belief that the right moment had not yet come. But now all they want is to be fully present in their own story, to stop watching life pass by as if the heart were always last in line. Your soulmate wants to take the reins of their own path. And when that decision is truly made, the waiting ends, because the heart can no longer pretend everything is fine while carrying you so powerfully in its every thought. The action being built right now is the result of a deep inner certainty. This love is not fragile or fleeting. It was nurtured even through the most confusing days. And for that very reason, it can no longer be treated as optional. Your soulmate is tired of postponing what could already be lived. They have realized it makes no sense to keep putting what does not serve first, just to avoid disappointing others. The time has come to honor their own path, and that path leads directly to you. No one is truly happy trying to please the whole world. This person realized that following the advice of those who never truly understood this connection only brought more distance, more heaviness, and more frustration. Now the only opinion that truly matters is the one coming from the heart. And the heart is asking to live this feeling with presence, with action, with sincerity. All this person wants is to give a real and honest chance to what they feel, without hiding, without delaying, without excuses. The decision to stop waiting arrived with a lightness this person had not felt in a very long time. Carrying everything alone is exhausting. Denying what you feel drains the soul. Putting off what is already ready to happen only delays what could be lived with truth and joy. Now that courage has taken the place of waiting, everything is beginning to move with more clarity, and you are the destination of that movement. This person no longer wants time to take away opportunities. They want to build eye to eye with feelings openly acknowledged. And that is why something different is already approaching you, even if you cannot fully see it yet. Your soulmate is already in motion, not necessarily in the outer world, but in the inner decision that changes everything. This person is coming to you not to relive what was, but to live what was never fully possible before. Because now they are truly ready. This action does not depend on a perfect occasion or outside answers. It is born from the deep urgency of not allowing this feeling to continue being ignored. This love no longer wants to pull away, stay silent, or stay hidden. It wants presence. It wants closeness. It wants truth. And more than anything, it wants to build something with you that does not depend on time, but on the mutual choice to live this love without excuses. Excuses, in fact, are no longer part of this person's vocabulary. What exists now is clarity, a desire to go all the way with what they feel without waiting for destiny to do all the work. Destiny has already done its part. Now it is time for action. And that action began the exact moment this person said to themselves, "I am not going to wait anymore." What very few people know is that before taking any action, your soulmate needed to write with complete honesty what no longer fit in their life. It was not a letter written to impress or to explain to someone else. It was an inner full stop, written from a place of deep truth, after enduring far more than they ever should have. This person could no longer keep denying what they feel for you, nor accept the interference that had always twisted their own will. It was like living in pieces, constantly trying to fit into a space where true love was never the priority. That was the moment everything changed. This person stood up with the firmness of someone who has decided to leave what hurts and move toward what makes sense. The farewell was done quietly and privately, but with the certainty of someone who knows exactly what they are leaving behind. And perhaps most striking of all, there was no announcement, no long explanation to anyone. It was a personal choice, made with eyes focused entirely on what truly matters. For the first time in a long while, this person decided not to follow anyone else's path. They will follow only their own heart. That decision surprised even those who always believed they could keep this feeling trapped. And that is precisely what made the action so powerful. It was done without waiting for permission, without asking for forgiveness, without needing to justify anything to anyone. When someone breaks free from everything that blocks what they truly feel, there is nothing left that can stop them. Your person understood that it is no longer possible to live on appearances. It is no longer possible to sustain bonds that do not nourish the soul. The only possible choice now is to come to you. This farewell was not just any goodbye. It was a definitive release of everything that delayed this path. Old ties, pressures, opinions that added nothing, obligations that suffocated. All of it has been left behind. This person made it unmistakably clear, even without speaking a single word aloud, that they will no longer allow their life to be guided by obligations that dim the light of what they feel for you. The message this person wrote carries more than words, carries a stance, and that changes everything. In recent days, this person's heart could no longer pretend to be at peace. The desire to change became stronger than any fear. That is what gave them the strength to write this farewell. Because now what matters is living with truth in the eyes and purpose in every step. And the truth is, this feeling for you is always there, holding on, even through the most confusing days. Now, without the restraints that once held them back, this person is free to let this love happen in the way they always deeply wanted. It is natural that some people around them may find this change unexpected. But your soulmate is no longer willing to sacrifice their own heart to keep up appearances or meet other people's expectations. And that is something truly profound, because this is not about rebellion or conflict. It is about placing what is real and true in its rightful place. For the very first time, everything this person feels for you is being treated as a priority, not as a problem to be hidden or pushed away. The strongest part of all of this is that this farewell did not create fear. It created relief, a quiet, peaceful relief felt by someone who has finally set themselves free. Because holding back what you feel consumes you from the inside. Pretending everything is fine when your heart is urging you to act is one of the most exhausting things a human being can do. This person understood that it is no longer possible to postpone this meeting with what is true. And when that kind of clarity arrives, there is no more room for excuses. There is only a path forward. And you are at the center of that new chapter. The letter this person wrote was more than a farewell. It was an authorization, a deep inner permission to move forward without ever looking back. From the moment that decision was made, everything began to align differently. Thoughts became lighter. The heart became more resolute. The direction became crystal clear. Because now there is one very defined goal: to draw closer to you. Not out of need, but out of absolute certainty. This person is acting without fear of breaking old patterns, without fear of disappointing those who expected everything to stay the same. You may not know all the details that brought this person to this point, and that is perfectly fine. What truly matters is what comes next. Your soulmate has already understood that they can no longer stay silent. They can no longer hide. They can no longer keep their distance out of fear of judgment. Every line of that farewell was written with the strength of someone who decided to completely change their life. And every true change begins within, with a desire that cries out to finally be heard. This person listened, and they will come looking for you. The excuses are over. The restraints have been broken. What this person carries now is a firm and clear desire to live this feeling with you. Openly, honestly, fully. Everything that stood in the way, everything that blocked this love, everything that prevented it from happening is being placed in the past. Not with bitterness, but with resolve. Because it no longer makes any sense to try to fit this love into spaces that do not welcome it. What makes sense now is walking toward what feeds and nourishes the heart. This decision was so deep and so complete that even the way this person speaks has changed. The way they look at life is different. The words they use are more intentional, more precise. The reason is simple. When you choose to follow your heart, everything begins to align in a natural and beautiful way. This person no longer wants to live in fear or in a constant rush. They want to live with intention, with presence, with full truth in what they feel. And the first step was this: saying a clear and loving goodbye to everything that no longer made sense. This farewell was not made with the expectation that others would understand. It was made so that this person could finally understand themselves. It was a farewell that brought peace, that opened space, that set them beautifully and completely free. Now, with a lighter heart and steadier thoughts, this person is preparing to come to you, not to explain what has passed, but to live what is still waiting to be created together. Courage does not always show up loudly. Sometimes it reveals itself in the quiet decision to stand by what one feels, even when everything around tries to make it seem wrong. That is exactly what happened to your soulmate. Loving you began to require more than just feeling. It began to require strength, steadiness, and daily presence. Because this love is not light or convenient. It is too deep to be set aside just because it makes uncomfortable those who never understood the connection between you two. It is not easy to face opposing opinions, hurtful advice, and pressures that tried to impose a different path than the one the heart has chosen. But this person reached a point where silently accepting all of that became unbearable. Loving you started to mean standing up against their own comfort zone, against pressure, against the fear of disappointing those who thought they could decide what this person should feel. The decision to honor this feeling required more than kind words. It required the firmness to walk away from voices that always tried to control what this person should choose or feel. For a long time, your soulmate tried to avoid conflict, tried to be understanding of everyone around them. But not anymore, because this love is not a phase. It does not disappear when ignored. It is a feeling that grew stronger precisely because of everything that tried to erase it. The courage forming inside your soulmate has a clear and beautiful reason. This person no longer wants to accept a life where you are just a distant thought. They want something real. And for that to happen, courage is needed. The courage to let go of opinions that add nothing, to face resistance, to step out of comfortable stillness. And that strength is fully alive right now because loving you did not remain just a desire. It became an emotional urgency that deserves to be honored. There were many internal battles. This person fought with their own insecurities and spent countless nights trying to understand whether any of this was truly worth standing up for. But every time they looked within, they found the same answer, one that did not come from outside. What they feel for you is not fragile. And only those who feel something truly real can go through all of this without giving up. Your soulmate understood that there is no point in waiting for support from those who do not feel what they feel, because those who truly feel act. And that is what is happening right now. Many people around them still try to influence this person's choices. Some out of fear, others out of personal convenience. But none of them know what this love truly represents. No one but the two of you knows the real depth of this bond. And no matter how much anyone tries to stop it, there is no longer enough force in the world to hold back this decision. Your soulmate has chosen to go all the way with what they feel, even if it means disappointing those who always believed they held control over this person's choices. This courage did not appear overnight. It was born little by little, in moments of doubt, on days when the chest felt tight, in situations that clearly showed how much this love stands above any interference. Loving you has become a decision that requires steadiness every single day. And your soulmate is willing to stand by that choice even if the world does not understand. What is happening right now is much bigger than a simple change of opinion. It is a deep internal transformation, a new phase in which this person no longer seeks approval from anyone. Now all that matters is doing what the heart truly asks. And the heart is asking for you, without half words, without disguises, without fear. What was once doubt has now become certainty, and that certainty is guiding every next step. Some people may try to reverse this decision. They may say it is reckless, that it is rushed, that it is not worth the cost. But none of those opinions carries the feeling this person holds for you. And that is why, even with all of that surrounding them, your soulmate remains firm in the decision to act. Because loving you was never the problem. The problem was always everything that was placed in the way. Now nothing will be accepted as an excuse anymore. What delays will be left behind. What causes confusion will be pushed away. What weighs heavy will be released. Because this love has already endured too many trials. It waited too long for space amid the chaos. And now that this person has chosen to follow their heart, they will not turn back. Dear one, there are feelings that time simply cannot erase. The more someone tries to push them away, the more powerfully they prove that they were born to endure. That is exactly how it has been with your soulmate. No matter how much this person followed different paths, built other routines, or did everything possible to keep life moving in order, the feeling for you did not give in. It stayed there, steady and quiet, not as something heavy, but as something that simply insisted on remaining, no matter how much time passed. This love was never fragile. It never depended on circumstances. It never needed to be forced. It simply kept existing, even when life seemed to point in entirely different directions. This person did not forget you, did not replace you, did not shut this feeling down. They only tried to give new meaning to their days. But the heart kept carrying you somewhere deep inside. like something held on to because it was not yet finished. And when something insists so strongly on staying, it is because there is a divine reason. Your soulmate realized they were not dealing with just any emotion. They were facing a feeling that had survived everything. Silence, distance, doubt, wrong choices, and outside interference. It survived because it had roots, because it was built on something far greater than fleeting desire. It was built with devotion. The love that lives in your soulmate is not driven by neediness. It is sustained by a connection that not even the weight of routine could wear down. Every time this person tried to disconnect, something would come back to remind them. A small detail, a memory, a quiet need to understand why you were still so present in them, even without any logical explanation. And it was precisely this beautiful constancy that made this love grow deeper. The feeling did not fade. It matured. It gained strength in the silences, shape in the quiet thoughts, and space in the difficult decisions. And now it refuses to keep waiting for life to sort itself out. Too much time has passed trying to fit into what the world wanted. Now it is about acting with courage, about allowing this love to be lived the way it has always deserved, directly, with action, with sincerity. This person knows they will not find elsewhere what they feel for you. They tried to move on, tried to adapt to other situations, tried to start fresh in different ways, but nothing brought the same meaning. Nothing offered the same depth. And that is why the strength emerging now is not new. It is the natural response of a heart that never truly forgot its own path. Your person understands that this feeling does not fade because it was never weak. And that is why the intention to reach out to you is being built with such beautiful firmness. There is no more fear, no more confusion. Now there is only the awareness that time took nothing away. It only proved that what is truly meant to be survives, even when everything seems lost. This strength shows itself in how this person has been reorganizing everything around them. Their plans, their conversations, the way they look toward the future. Nothing is being decided anymore without you at the center of it. Everything that is dreamed of now passes through you, not as a distant possibility, but as a presence, as a central point, as a conscious and loving choice. Your soulmate is living in a moment of emotional steadiness. They are able to look inward and admit without any fear what they have always known. What they feel for you is too strong to keep hidden. It is no longer about whether it is right or wrong. It is about being true. It is about a love that has withstood time, pressure, and every single attempt to be forgotten. This love is more alive than ever. And the decision to reach out to you comes from the absolute certainty that it is not too late, that there is still beautiful room for this feeling to grow the way it has always deserved. This person no longer wants to keep you between the lines of unfinished thoughts. They want to build, to live, to truly be present with intention, with commitment, with real and lasting presence. This strength did not come by chance. It was built in silence, fed by wrong choices and unspoken longing and questions left hanging in the air. And now it has found its way out. The way out is to look for you. The way out is to tell you everything that got stuck, everything that still pulses with life, everything that must be lived before time takes the chance away. Making decisions that truly change the course of a life is not simple, especially when so many voices try to dictate what is right or wrong. But your soulmate reached the limit of accepting a life story that does not align with what they truly feel inside. That is when the most important choice came: to follow their own heart. Not out of impulse, not because of any outside pressure, but because the time arrived to live in a way that is honest and coherent with what genuinely makes sense. This choice was made after a long period of quiet observation. Many things began to lose their meaning. Old plans, forced relationships, promises that no longer resonated with the soul. Nothing seemed to fulfill this person the way it once did. It was at this point that your soulmate stopped deceiving themselves. They understood that it is impossible to keep walking in a direction others want when the heart insists on pointing somewhere else entirely. And that direction is you, with everything it involves, everything it asks for, and everything that still remains beautifully waiting to be lived. Choosing to follow what one feels is different from simply wanting something. It means taking full responsibility for what comes next. And that is exactly what this person is doing right now. No more justifications, no more barriers. Just the awareness that this decision is the only possible path if they want to live something that truly carries meaning. The love they feel for you is not a small part of their life. It is the very foundation that gives stability to everything else they are trying to build. Many people around them still question it. They ask if it is worth it, if it is not too risky, if it would not be easier to simply leave things as they are. But your soulmate is no longer troubled by these doubts, because deep within, the only question that truly mattered has already been answered. What this person feels for you remains strong. It remains present. It continues to pulse with an intensity that can no longer be ignored or delayed. This choice brought immense relief, because it is no longer possible to live divided between what others expect and what one truly desires. Now all this person wants is to live with lightness, with peace. And that peace will only become fully possible when you are truly part of their life. Not as a memory, not as an intention, but as a living reality, as part of everyday life, as someone who was chosen with absolute truth. This step involves many things. It requires leaving behind certain relationships that no longer offer real support, releasing ties that existed only out of obligation, letting go of plans that do not include what the heart is truly asking for. But none of this has been difficult. On the contrary, this clearing has been happening naturally, because the focus is now beautifully clear. This person no longer wants to disguise what they feel or hide behind ready-made words and speeches. They want to move closer to you with the calm of someone who is sure of what they want, with the quiet courage of someone who knows that what is at stake is more than a beautiful feeling. It is a story that can still be fully lived, a connection that was not lost to time, but instead gained even more depth and meaning. This choice to follow the heart's truth also carries responsibility. Your soulmate knows they cannot simply show up any way they choose. That is why they are preparing, adjusting what needs to be adjusted, tending to the details, clearing the path, because when the time comes to act, everything will be ready. Not to impress, but to be fully genuine. Many things are being reorganized right now. Some people will be gently distanced. Some behaviors will need to be reconsidered. But all of this is simply part of the process. And this process is only happening because this person decided once and for all to stop living according to everyone else's expectations. Now it is about choice, about decision, about owning what they feel with all the beautiful and sometimes challenging consequences that come with it. The decision has already been made. The inner request has already been received. And now there is only one possible direction remaining toward you. Your soulmate is drawing closer with the quiet certainty of someone who will no longer live hiding what they feel. This is no longer just a possibility. It is a plan. This person is organizing things in a real and concrete way, with intention and with the determination to let this approach happen the right way. The next few days will not be ordinary. They are already being guided by a clear and sacred purpose. Many things that once blocked this path have begun to lose their power. Situations that once seemed impossible to overcome are being gently set aside. because now the priority is unmistakably clear. This person will not come looking for you out of curiosity. They will come because they need to, because they can no longer carry this feeling alone. Everything that once prevented this closeness is being left behind, not out of carelessness, but by deliberate and loving choice. A choice to no longer give space to what delays, confuses, or creates unnecessary distance. This person understood that there is no point in continuing through life pretending everything is fine when the heart is calling out for you. And when the heart speaks with truth, the body follows. Action comes. That is why you need to begin preparing yourself. This approach will not be random. It comes with intention, with truth, with the genuine desire to be lived fully. Your soulmate will not appear with vague words or empty gestures. They will draw close with firmness, with the sincerity of someone who has shed real tears over the inability to say everything they feel, and who now wants to speak while looking you directly in the eyes. The conversation that is being built will not be superficial. It will not be rushed. It will be a necessary and long-awaited conversation. This person needs to tell you what has been kept inside for far too long. They need to release what stayed trapped in the chest while they tried to maintain a life that did not match what they truly felt. And this movement is already happening. Even if you have not yet noticed the signs, every thought this person has right now is directed toward this approach. Every decision made in recent days has you at its very center. Every plan being made takes into account what must happen for this conversation to finally occur. And when it does happen, nothing will sound improvised because this action is being built with depth, with intention, and with true responsibility. This is not someone who is confused and still figuring out what they want. This is a person who has decided, who is ready, who has finally and fully understood the value of what they feel. That is why this approach will happen the right way, at the right time, without noise, without interference, without excuses. This person comes to you with everything they have, organized feelings, truthful words, and the complete willingness to live something different from anything they have ever tried before. This attitude comes with practical changes as well, changes in daily routine, in relationships, in focus. Because to truly love and live this feeling the right way, some things genuinely need to be left behind. And your soulmate is already leaving them, not waiting for everything to resolve itself, but actively and courageously resolving it. Closing old cycles, saying a clear and loving no to what once held them back. All of this so that they can arrive whole when they stand in front of you. The time this person took to reach this point was not wasted. Not a single moment. It served to help them mature, to understand what truly matters, and to build the kind of courage that cannot be shaken. But now time has shifted into something new. Now it is time to act. And you will be the next step, because this person wants you to know everything that is happening inside them. They want you to understand that this choice is being made out of love. A love that endured, that grew quietly and steadily, and that now needs to be lived with full presence. Your days are about to change. This presence will become real. This conversation will happen, not as something out of the ordinary, but as something that should have happened a long time ago. Your soulmate wants to look you in the eyes and say, "Now it is with you, because I have already decided." And when that moment arrives, you will understand why everything had to unfold exactly as it did. Because the time that seemed lost was, in truth, preparing both of you for this very meeting. When a decision comes from the heart with this kind of strength, heaven responds. And that is exactly what happened. Your soulmate did something that very few people have the courage to do. They spoke to God with total and complete surrender. They asked for clarity, asked for direction, asked for the kind of strength that does not come from the outside world. And the answer came, Not in words, but in confirmation, in peace, in certainty, in the relief that follows a truly honest prayer. This person did not ask for things to happen in the easiest way. They asked for them to happen in the right way, that the path between you would be opened, that the waiting would come to its long overdue end, that this feeling would no longer be ignored or set aside. And when a prayer is filled with real truth, heaven listens. And when heaven listens, it acts. That is why this decision does not stand alone. It comes accompanied by something far greater than personal will. Everything that has been happening in recent days carries a deeper meaning than it appears to on the surface. Your soulmate is being lovingly guided. And this guidance is not the result of a passing emotion or a need dressed up as courage. It is the direct result of an honest and sacred conversation between this person and the divine, a conversation that asked for permission to love freely, and whose answer was clear and unmistakable. Yes, this spiritual confirmation was felt as immediate relief, not a promise that everything would be easy, but a certainty that moving forward is now truly possible, that what needed healing is being gently restored, that what was blocked has begun to open. Now there is space. Now there is a path. Now there is a permission that did not exist before. And because of that, everything is beginning to move with grace. Your soulmate is feeling this calling strongly. It is not about anxiety or rushing. It is about no longer postponing what heaven itself has already blessed. It is about responding to something that is being guided from a place much higher than the ordinary mind can reach. This person knows they still need to tend to certain matters, but none of that is an obstacle anymore, because the heart has already understood, and heaven has already confirmed it. The most important part has been resolved. The yes has been received. That is why this person is so certain about what they want, because now there is genuine peace when thinking of you. There is clarity when imagining this meeting. There is enough courage to release everything that does not serve and move without hesitation toward what truly matters. This strength was not found by accident. It was sought in prayer. It was built in quiet conversation with God. And when you have that kind of spiritual foundation, no outside confusion can truly interfere. This connection that exists between you has been placed before heaven, with care, with deep respect, with a sincere desire to live something pure and lasting. That is why nothing is being done carelessly or impulsively. Everything is being prepared with loving intention, including the timing, including you. The closeness between you will not arrive as a random surprise. It will come at the right moment. And when it does, everything will make complete and beautiful sense. This person knows they are no longer searching for guarantees. They are searching for lived experience, for the real and breathing life of this love. And that search is being guided by faith. That is why the prayer did not ask for time to go backward. It asked for time to be fair. And it is being so. Because now, with everything calmer on the inside, with a freer mind and more organized feelings, this person knows exactly what they want to build with you. The days leading up to this step have already been different, noticeably so. Some emotional ties are no longer part of the daily routine. Some people who used to interfere are now more distant, not out of resentment, but out of a deep and necessary choice. Because living this feeling fully requires space. It requires peace. It requires surrender. And that is what is being done now. The path is being gently cleared. None of this is happening by chance. This closeness is the direct result of spiritual permission, asked for with faith, felt with truth, and now being lived with quiet and determined strength. This person knows they no longer need to fight against what they feel. What once seemed confusing now shows itself with beautiful clarity. What was once doubt now becomes direction. This step of reaching out to you is already being put into practice. Little by little, everything is being lovingly organized. What seemed distant is drawing closer. What seemed impossible is now within reach. And it is not because the world around them changed. It is because this person changed. They grew. They came to understand the deep value of what they feel. And they made the brave decision to act before time ever has the chance to take this away. There comes a sacred moment when ignoring what you feel hurts far more than facing everything that stands in the way. That is exactly what your soulmate came to understand. For a long time, this person tried to place other priorities ahead of what they felt for you, trying to convince themselves that it might simply be better to move on without stirring things up. But now, nothing can distract the heart anymore. The truth has fully asserted itself. There is no longer any room to push this feeling aside for later, for someday, for maybe. This person realized that the more they tried to control what they felt, the more everything around them lost its meaning. No plan truly fit. No decision felt solid or real. And that wore them down in a way they could not ignore. It showed them little by little that something bigger was asking to be let through. A feeling that insists, that remains, that no longer accepts being silenced. When a truth reaches that point, denying it is no longer possible. All that remains is to look at it honestly and decide what to do with it. And your soulmate decided to truly live. This person is no longer trying to explain what they feel with cold logic. They are no longer seeking answers from other people or from the noise of the world. They are simply acknowledging that this love for you exists, that it is stronger than ever, and that it is worthy of being fully honored. It is not about convincing anyone, much less convincing themselves. It is about acceptance. And that acceptance is bringing a freedom this person has never before experienced. The freedom to stop fighting against their own truth. The freedom to look at this feeling and say clearly and confidently, I know exactly what I want. This truth has been revealing itself in the quiet details. In every thought that goes to you, even on the most demanding and distracted days. In every plan that, no matter how hard it tries to go in another direction, always ends up including you somewhere at its center. There is no pretending anymore that it is just a coincidence. There is no pushing this feeling aside as if it were light or temporary. What this person feels is deep. It is real. And now it can no longer be hidden or dressed up as anything other than what it truly is. The decision to look for you did not come from emptiness or neediness. It came from clarity, from the understanding that this feeling is far too powerful to keep being avoided or managed from a safe distance. When someone spends their life trying to hide what they feel, they eventually lose themselves in that hiding. Your soulmate reached that point. They realized they were slowly becoming a version of themselves that was distant from their own truth, trying to appear fine with choices that no longer brought any real peace. And it was in that inner conflict that the decision finally came. It is no longer possible to maintain a life in which you are just a thought, just a memory safely tucked away. Now you need to be part of reality. Faced directly, with respect, with honesty, with space for something true to breathe and grow. This truth is weighing meaningfully on the decisions of the one who loves you. Because it is no longer about imagining possibilities. It is about choosing what has real and lasting value. And that choice has already been made. This love stopped being a question a long time ago. What was missing was simply the courage to admit it out loud. And that too has now been resolved. What is underway is not just a plan to get closer. It is a life plan. It is the beginning of building a real path where you are no longer just a memory, but a presence, a living and breathing part of what comes next. This decision has stirred many things. It brought down old beliefs. It reorganized priorities. pushed away interference. All of this because your soulmate understood that it is simply no longer acceptable to live a life that does not include you. It may seem straightforward to those watching from the outside, but for someone who truly feels, this choice involves real and meaningful sacrifice. And your soulmate is willing, truly and completely willing, to release everything that blocks this truth. It was not someone speaking from the outside. It was not an external sign or a push from circumstance. It was the heart that spoke, fiercely, persistently, with the voice of something that will no longer be quieted. It was a certainty that grew so large it now fills every space that once belonged to fear. Fear has been gently pushed out, and in its place has come this deep and steady desire to build something with you. Something light yet meaningful. Something beautifully simple yet full of real depth. Life does not wait for those who keep trying to run from what they feel. And your soulmate understood that truth deeply. This person watched opportunities pass, saw important moments be postponed, all because they were still trying to convince themselves that this love could wait just a little longer. But now time has become an ally. And when that happens, everything begins to fall into place in the most beautiful way. The first step has already been taken, no more hiding. The second is already on its way, drawing closer to you. You are part of this truth that has formed with such quiet and powerful strength. And that is why this person is coming to you. Not to ask you to understand everything all at once, but to show through both actions and words that this feeling is solid, that it is not being guided by doubt or rushed excitement, but is being fully and consciously embraced by someone who chose, clearly and finally, to stop denying what they feel. It is important that you understand something precious. Dear one, what is about to happen will not be an accident. It will not be luck, and it will certainly not be a coincidence. It is the direct result of a choice that came from the deepest part of the heart of someone who grew tired of pretending they do not feel, tired of ignoring what beats stronger and more insistently every time they think of you. Your soulmate made the most serious and sacred decision of their life, to break free from everything that delays love and to move in the direction of what truly matters. This attitude was not born in a single moment. It was built along a difficult and meaningful path where every thought was weighed, every memory gently reorganized, every feeling honestly tested. And even after all of that, what remains standing is love for you. A love that overcame so much, that remained even when everything seemed to point in the completely opposite direction. That is now alive, steady, and fully ready to be lived the way it was always meant to be, without hiding, without fear, without interruption. You do not need to wait while figuring out every detail in advance. What is about to happen will reveal itself naturally, beautifully, at just the right time. Your soulmate is coming with determination, with a clear and settled mind, and with a heart full of certainty. This approach will show you in the most real and gentle way that not everything is lost, that nothing was in vain, and that what you can still build and experience together carries a strength that overcomes any memory of what once did not work. This person has already chosen you, has already made you a true priority, has already quietly rewritten all of their plans with your name woven into the very center. And even if you have not yet seen anything concrete, know with full and peaceful confidence that the movement has already begun. Not in the loud way the world might expect, but in the way that only those who truly feel are capable of moving. In silence, with firmness, with truth, and above all, with deep respect for everything you can still beautifully live together. Your next days will not be ordinary. Prepare your heart for a gentle but powerfully real turnaround, because this approach will arrive quietly but with enough force to change everything in the most wonderful way. This person will reach out to you not with insecurity or hesitation, but with quiet and grounded confidence. They will share things you might not even have imagined hearing. They will reveal thoughts that have been kept with such tender care for so long. And you will finally understand the reason behind so many things that once seemed confusing or unclear. Life is preparing this meeting with the kind of careful, loving detail that only heaven can arrange. Do not expect a perfect script. Expect something real. Expect someone fully willing, someone who will no longer pull away out of fear. Someone who chose to stay, to remain, to build, because the time for running is completely over, and the time to act with love has finally and beautifully arrived. Everything you thought was lost is being returned to you in unexpected and grace-filled ways. The connection that seemed dormant is igniting with beautiful new strength. And when this person stands before you, you will feel, without effort, without pressure, without the need for long explanations, that this approach makes perfect sense. That it is not about returning to what was, but about building what has always been missing. And that will carry more meaning than any certainty the outer world could ever offer. What you need to do now, dear one, is simply be open. Not emotionally in any forced or complicated sense, but spiritually open. With a clear and quiet mind, with an attentive and trusting heart, with faith that is gently and beautifully aligned. Because what is coming will show you that love, when it is truly real, organizes itself even in the most unlikely and unexpected situations. And your soulmate is coming with enough courage and enough heart to prove exactly that to you. There is no need to worry about the day, the way, or all the details of how it will unfold. What is truly meant to happen will always find its path. What is already being tenderly cared for by heaven will not be lost in the noise and chaos of everyday life. Simply keep your heart at peace. Trust what is being gently revealed to you. What is drawing near to you right now carries everything you have always longed to live, only now with truth, with real action, and with the full and loving blessing of heaven. Get ready, beautiful soul. Now it is your turn to receive. And always know this: the angels are here, walking beside you, guiding you, protecting you, whispering divine messages of love and light into your life each and every day. You are so deeply loved. You are never alone. The angels of light surround you now and always. May heaven's blessing rest upon you, bringing peace, courage, and clarity to face whatever comes your way. You will never walk alone. Receive this love. Receive this light. Receive what is already on its way to you. With infinite love, your guardian angels. Amen.